sometimes all you have left is hope, and that's enough. There was a cold gray morning on which Sarah first noticed him. Sitting silently at the side of the road, a golden retriever with tangled fur and weary eyes looked out on the horizon as if on the lookout for something or someone. The people of Millbrook, the small town where I grew up, talked in whispers about this dog who allegedly hung around for years and refused to leave. Poor thing, Sarah whispered to herself and snuggled her coat against the cold. Who would have left him behind? As she drank her coffee on the other side of the street, she couldn't stop thinking about the solitary soul who stood firm and still, willing the elements day after day. But later that afternoon, she succumbed to curiosity. Sarah crept closer to the dog, moving slowly and carefully. The dog seemed barely aware of her presence, eyes focused straight on the road. "Hey, buddy, you waiting for someone?" she said gently, kneeling down. The dog didn't flinch, didn't budge, only his eyes momentarily darted to her, imbued with an unmistakable sadness. "And you can have some of the sandwich I packed." He hesitated, but took it, and ate slowly, methodically. A passerby, a silver-haired gent with a kind face, paused beside her. "Been here for a long time, that one," he said with an exhale. 3 years, give or take. Always in the same spot. We call him Hope. Sarah's heart ached. Why hasn't someone taken him in? "He's not going to leave," the man said flatly. "It's like he's waiting for somebody who's never coming back." Sarah visited Hope every single day from that day on. She took him food and water, even a blanket to keep him warm. Every visit broke down his tender mercies, and finally, little by little, his tail began to wag, a little bit. "You're not alone, buddy," she whispered one night, rubbing his coarse fur. One afternoon, Sarah lingered longer, sitting on the sidewalk next to him. And at sunset, she felt curious that Hope's eyes were always trained in the same direction, down the long length of road that led out of town. "Whom do you seek, boy?" she wondered aloud. Knocking on doors around town, Sarah was intent on getting some answers. Some vaguely remembered a woman who had lived nearby but who had disappeared suddenly. Others theorized he had been abandoned by a traveler who did not come back. Sarah knew there was more to the story. She scrolled through online community pages, searching for anything that might offer insight into Hope's past. Then she found it. An old news story. A car wreck 3 years ago, on the very road where Hope sat every day. Her heart sank. "Is this the thing you're waiting for?" she said softly, glancing back at him. "The past never dies, even if you try to look the other way." Sarah kept thinking about Hope's story every day as she passed the place where he sat. Her heart ached with a little more loss. Something about his stubborn loyalty to that one place, to that invisible person he was waiting for, bothered her. Curious, she began asking about it. She sat down across from Mrs. Thompson, a longtime local resident who had seen Hope seated in the same spot forever. "Oh, dear, that poor dog." Mrs. Thompson sighed, stirring her tea. He was owned by a young woman named Claire. A sweet girl, she lived just outside of town, but one day she was gone. Sarah leaned in, intrigued. "Gone? What happened?" Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "Rumors, mostly. Some say she went away. Some say, well, something terrible happened. No one really knows. But that dog, he never left. Just stayed right there, looked at the road, as if he's expecting her to return." With this new information in hand, Sarah goes to visit Claire's old house. Overgrown weeds and dust now neglected the house that once kept promises. A pile of unopened letters sat by the entrance, and a sheet-covered piece of furniture lay against the back wall of the small room. She rapped tentatively, half expecting silence. An older man opened the cracked door to her surprise. "What do you want?" he asked gruffly. "Sorry to bother you," Sarah said gently. "I just wanted to know what happened to the dog. Hope. He has been in the same spot for years. I was told he was Claire's. Do you know anything?" The man sighed, and the storm cleared from his face. "Claire was my niece. She loved that dog more than she loved anything. She suddenly left town, and she never wrote to me again. But that dog, he never quit on her." Sarah swallowed as a lump formed in her throat. "Do you think she'll come back?" The man shook his head. "I don't know, but that dog appears to believe she will. Sometimes hope is all you have left." As she retraced her steps toward Hope's usual place, she noticed him peering deeply down the road, as though he was waiting for someone to show up at any moment. She sat next to him, putting a light hand on his back. "I wish you could tell me your story, boy," she whispered. "But I swear, I am not going to stop fighting you." Hope turned his head finally, leaning into her touch. It was a symbolic act of trust, one that ignited a resolve in Sarah's heart. On the evening of January 8, Sarah took to social media and posted a picture of Hope and shared his story. She asked whether anyone had heard of Claire. Someone outside of the small town, anyone. Theories and well-wishes came flooding in, but one had stood out to Sarah. "I used to know Claire. If you want to know, meet me at the old station tomorrow at noon." Sarah's heart pounded. Might this be the clue she sought? The answers we seek are found in the places we least expect sometimes. The following day, Sarah waited at the old train station, her chest tight with excitement. Beside the empty ticket counters, there were a number of traces of the one-time functioning train station. Colorful inserts have been taken from newspapers and posted on the station wall when there were big events happening. Rusting tracks extended forever, and tattered posters clung resentfully to the flaking walls. Hope remained on guard at his post, surveying the road with his eternal patience. Sarah looked at her phone. 11:55 a.m. Whoever the text message had been sent from was on their way. Minutes later, a woman in her late 50s walked up tentatively. She had a weathered face and kind, knowing eyes. "You must be Sarah," she said, her voice edged with warmth and sadness. "I'm Margaret. I used to work with Claire." Sarah nodded, wanting to know more. "Thank you for meeting me. Can you explain what happened?" Margaret sighed and plopped down on the worn bench. Claire was special. She loved that dog more than she loved anything. But after the accident, she couldn't stand to be in the place. She blazed on, staged, she packed, she never looked back. Sarah furrowed her brows. "The accident? What happened?" Margaret paused for a moment, then went on. "Just down that road, Claire's fiancé, Tom, got into a really bad car accident 3 years back. They were meant to begin a new life together. When he died, Claire couldn't take it. She left everything behind, hope included." Sarah's heart ached. "She never came back?" Margaret shook her head. "She sends postcards every now and then, but she's afraid to come back. She believes hope is better without her." Margaret monitored Sarah in silence for a moment, as if trying to digest the weight of her words. She thought of Hope, how he'd sat there day after day waiting for a face that might not come back. "Do you have any sense of where she is now?" Sarah asked, sounding newly confident. Margaret paused, then fished a faded postcard out of her purse. "This was a few months ago in a town 2 states away. She's in Willowbrook, so maybe if she knew Hope was still waiting for her, she she would come back. Sarah accepting the postcard, her mind racing with ideas. Could she find Claire? Would she even want to return? That evening, Sarah sat beside Hope again, stroking his fur as she whispered softly, "I think I found her, buddy, but it's not going to be easy." Hope, perched at the head of the bed, did not hear the sound of distant footsteps, but Hope turned his ears toward it. Sarah had a huge feeling of responsibility. This had nothing to do with a dog. It had to do with healing hearts, creating a reunion of hearts. It was giving Hope a happy ending. Sarah bundled a few things into a small bag and headed to Willowbrook, refusing to accept the possibility that she wouldn't find Claire. He had told her about Hope and Carol. The old guy who she had taken care of would take care of Hope in her absence. "Go, bring her home," Carol said with an encouraging smile. Hope deserves his happy ending. And as Sarah drove away, she looked back once in her rearview mirror and saw that Hope remained where he was, looking steadily forward. It was a long drive to Willowbrook, and she wondered what she might discover. Sarah ran through all that Margaret had said to her. Claire's heartbreak, her choice to leave, and the postcards that she kept sending. After finally arriving in the small town, she entered a small street that had charming shops and inviting cafes. It was relatively easy to track down Claire's address, a tiny apartment on top of a bookstore. Sarah took a deep breath and banged on the door. The door creaked open, and standing there was Claire, with worn-out eyes and a surprise and fear-filled expression. "Who are you?" Claire asked cautiously. Sarah inhaled deeply and smiled softly. "I'm here about Hope. Part of moving forward is going back for a bit." Claire remained frozen in the doorway, her eyes a blend of shock and sadness. It felt as though the name Hope reverberated in her head, bringing the memories she had fought as well as she could to forget for so many years. "Hope," she said, barely able to process what she was saying. Sarah offered a kind smile. "Yes, he is still waiting for you. He's never left that spot." Claire's eyes filled with tears as she clutched the edge of the doorframe for support. She inhaled shakily and waved for Sarah to enter. The tiny apartment was unpretentious, lined with books and photographs that suggested a life Claire had attempted to reconstruct. "I left everything behind," Claire said quietly as she sat down on the couch. I thought he would get over it." Sarah sat opposite her and bled her words. "We dogs like Hope don't just move on, Claire. He's been waiting for you every day. Everyone in the town knows his story. That's why they call him Hope." Claire exhaled with a tremor and rubbed her hands. "I don't know if I can come back, Sarah. It hurts too much." Claire's fear made sense to Sarah. Too often the burden of the past seemed unbearably heavy, but she also saw something in Claire's eyes, a desire to make things right. "I understand," Sarah said quietly, "but perhaps it's time to give him some closure. And perhaps it'll give you some comfort, too." Claire turned her head away, looking out the window across the busy street below. "I don't know if I'm that strong." Sarah dug in her bag and pulled out a photo she had taken of Hope sitting in his usual space, gazing steadfastly down the road. "He thinks you're coming back, and I think you want to as well." Claire's hand shook as she snapped the photo. She traced the image with her finger, a tear rolling down her cheek. He looked so lost. It was a long moment before Claire finally nodded, concession washing over her. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll go back. I owe him that much." Neo let out a breath, relief flooding her. "We'll do it together." Claire packed a small bag, but at the door she paused, looking contemplatively back at the apartment she had lived in for the past few years. It wasn't much, but it had been her refuge from the hurt she had departed from. "It's time," Sarah assured her, extending a hand. Claire accepted it with a grateful nod, and they stepped into the unknown. It was a silent drive back to Millbrook, all words left unspoken. Claire gazed at the rolling hills outside, lost in thought, while Sarah kept her eyes straight ahead. Sometimes Claire would look at Hope's photo, almost for strength. "Do you think he'll remember me?" Claire asked softly. Sarah smiled. "I think he never forgot you." By the time they were just a few blocks from the familiar roads that would lead to Millbrook, Claire's hands were too tight around her bag. She was returning to a chapter of her life she believed would never open again. "Almost there," Sarah said softly. Claire nodded, looking down the road ahead. A figure far off, small but unmistakable, was sitting exactly where she had left him all those years ago. When the car came to a slow stop, Claire cautiously opened the door. In slow steps she moved forward, her heart frank as a thunder. Sensing something unusual, Hope looked up and their eyes met. For a brief moment, there was nothing. And then, suddenly understanding, Hope flew across the room to her, tail a blur, eyes clouded by years of waiting and yearning. Claire dropped to her knees, threw her arms around him, and cried into his fur. "I'm sorry," she said under her breath. "I missed you so much." Sarah stepped back, tears in her own eyes, knowing that this was everything Hope had been longing for. Forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it can change the future. Hope pressed his head against Claire's chest, and his tail wagged slowly, as if afraid to believe her presence was real. Claire hugged him tight, tears cascading down her cheeks, whispering apologies and love into his fur. Sarah, standing a few feet away, felt her own feelings welling up inside of her. It was a moment of raw, unfiltered love, a reunion years in the making. Finally, after what felt like an age, Claire pulled back a little, holding Hope's face in her hands. "I always thought about you, boy," she said. I didn't know if I could come face to face with this town again." Hope gave a lick to her hand, as if to say that none of it mattered now. As they strolled back into town together, heads turned and whispers followed them. Hope had become part of the Millbrook family, and their thoughts turned to the sight of Claire returning with their dog. "Claire!" Mrs. Thompson was calling from her shopfront, apron in hand. "Is it really you?" Claire gave a small, tentative smile. "Yeah, it's me." Mrs. Thompson came over, tears in her eyes. "You have no idea how much that dog has done for ourselves as a family. He's been waiting for you, sweetheart. I hope you know that." Claire nodded, the words a barely audible whisper. "I know, and I regret for every single day that I left him here." When they reached the house that had once been Claire's home, she paused at the front gate. She recalled her life with Tom, the laughter on the porch, the aspirations they had held, the day everything fell apart. Sarah put a reassuring hand on Claire's shoulder. "You don't have to go in if you're not ready." Claire took a deep breath. "No, I need to do this. For Hope, and for me." Her hands shaking, she unlocked the door and went in. Dust blanketed the furniture, and everything was just the way she had left it, frozen in time. Hope entered next to her, his nose wiggling in some part of you, as if, in order to receive the smell of the place he knew so well. Claire walked inside the house, and the heaviness of her past hit her like a freaking ton of bricks. She sank onto the lumpy couch, hiding her face in her hands. "I left, and I thought it would be easier," she said quietly. "But I was wrong." Sarah sat beside her. "Claire, running never gets rid of the past. But facing it head on? That's how you heal. Day by day, Claire began to reintegrate into the life of Millbrook. She clung to familiar faces and to the unconditional love Hope had never wavered in giving her. They went together to the park where she and Tom used to walk, following old paths, creating new memories along the way. Hope flourished with Claire back by his side, his eyes shining, his tail swaying more often. He no longer waited at the roadside. Now he walked proudly beside her, as if he knew the wait was over. One afternoon, sitting on the shore of the lake, Claire looked at Sarah and said, "I think I'm ready to stay. Perhaps this is where I really belong after all." Sarah smiled. "I think so too. And I know Hope agrees." With Claire's help, the shelter now had a new rehabilitation program for dogs who were in need of extra love and care. And as this hope morphed from the hopelessness of want and pain to a promise of new beginnings, in tandem, they were evidence that even the deepest of wounds could become whole through time, patience, and love. Healing is not the same as the damage never having existed. It means we're not letting the pain decide our life anymore. Weeks turned into months, and Claire gradually readjusted to the pace of life in Millbrook. With Hope at her side, she started to rediscover the town she had once loved, and the community that had never forgotten her. Every morning, Sarah met up with Claire and Hope in the park, while the golden retriever wandered around at his own pace, his tail wagging with a newfound happiness. Claire looked at him, a bittersweet smile on her lips. "I can't believe he waited all this time," she said quietly. Sarah nodded. "Love does that. It waits longer than we think it can." Claire bent down and scratched behind Hope's ears. "I don't deserve him." Sarah gave her a reassuring smile. "He doesn't see it that way. To him, you're home." One afternoon, Mrs. Thompson invited Claire to go to the local bakery with her, where she and Tom used to go. She accepted nervously, knowing it was another step in confronting her past. Walking through the familiar door, the smell of warm bread and pastries filled her senses, causing a rush of recollection. Mrs. Thompson welcomed her with a big hug. "It's nice to see you back, Claire." Claire smiled as she tightened her grip on Hope's leash. "It feels good to be here again." Kicking back with an old friend, Tom made her feel good through the stories, shared dreams, and the life she had on hold. She understood that she had prevented herself from living fully by holding on to the pain of losing him. "He'd want you to be happy, dear," Mrs. Thompson said, squeezing her hand, "and I think Hope always knew that to be the case as well." Claire nodded, blinking back tears. "I think I'm beginning to believe that." Claire's growing confidence in her decision to stay made her want to give back to a town that had cared for Hope while Claire was gone. She called over to Carol and offered to volunteer at the shelter. "I'd love to help however I can," Claire said as she stood in the shelter's lobby, Hope sitting calmly beside her. Carol beamed. "We could use the help, and I believe Hope would be a perfect ambassador for the shelter." And from then on, Claire spent her afternoons walking the shelter dogs, telling would-be adopters about Hope, comforting those who had yet to find their forever homes. One night, sitting on her porch, Claire watched as Hope slept peacefully at her feet. Finally, she could breathe freely. Guilt that had lingered in her for decades was beginning to be replaced with gratitude. "I needed you more than you needed me," she whispered, stroking through his fur. Hope thumped her tail softly, an affirmation that all was as it should be. Sarah came shortly after to sit beside Claire. "You look lighter, happier," Claire nodded. "For the first time I've felt in a long time, I feel like I'm right where I'm supposed to be, As Claire and Hope continued their journey, the two became inseparable, not just as owner and pet, but as two souls that needed comfort in each other. The townspeople embraced Claire, and day after day, she discovered new reasons to remain. With Sarah's prodding, Claire even started to think about writing up her journey, love and loss, and the way a loyal dog had helped her turn toward home. You never know when someone needs to hear your story, Sarah smiled. Claire gazed down at Hope, who met her eyes with unyielding loyalty. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time. Healing occurs in moments, not milestones. Days melted into each other, and somehow Claire was growing accustomed to life in Millbrook. Walking those streets again, this time with Hope beside her, they seemed new and familiar and comforting. Her past no longer weighed her down the way it used to. It was just part of her story now, one she was finally ready to embrace. One morning, Claire received an unexpected call from Sarah inviting her to the town's upcoming community fair. "It's a big deal around here," Sarah said with a grin, "and I think it's time you reacquainted yourself with everybody." Claire hesitated, just thinking of having all those people around, talking to everyone and answering questions about where she'd been and what had led her to leave made her nervous. But the encouraging look from Sarah's and the gentle nudge from Hope gave her the courage to say, "Okay, let's do it." It was the day of the fair, and Claire was impressed by the sounds of laughter, music, and the mouth-watering smell of awfully local food stalls. As she passed the throng, Hope by her side, his tail trembling, people welcomed her with kindness and warmth. Some embracing her, others telling her about how they looked after Hope in her absence. Mrs. Thompson waved excitedly from her booth. "Claire, dear, so good to see you out and about." And Hope. "Oh, he looks happier than he ever was." Claire smiled, having found a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she needed. "I appreciate you taking care of him when I was away," she said graciously. Mrs. Thompson gave Claire's hand a pat. "We all did what we could, but he was always waiting for you." As Claire strolled through the fair, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Claire?" As she pivoted around, she was met by Tom's sister, Lisa. They had last talked at Tom's funeral, and the hurt remained in Lisa's eyes. "I didn't know you were back," Lisa said, her voice soft but laced with feeling. Claire swallowed hard to dislodge the lump in her throat. "I didn't know if I was ready, but Hope brought me back." Lisa smiled faintly down at the golden retriever. "He never gave up on you, and I suppose I realized that you needed time." Claire exhaled, relieved. "I'm sorry for disappearing. I just wasn't ready to look at it." Lisa nodded. "None of us could. But I'm glad you're here now. Tom would have wanted that." A tear trickled down Claire's cheek, but she swiped it away. "Thank you, Lisa. That means more to you than you know." As the fair went on, Hope became the main attraction. Children flocked around him, laughing as he did little tricks Claire had taught him through the years. Tears of joy, not sorrow, filled Claire's eyes to see him so happy and so full of life. "I think he's finally at peace now," Sarah murmured next to her. Claire nodded. "And I think I am too." A local news reporter sought them out after hearing about Hope's story. "Would you tell our readers about his journey?" he asked. Claire paused for a second, but she smiled. "I'd love to. I think people need to know how amazing he is." That evening, with the fair lights glowing in the distance, she settled on her porch with the dog Hope at her feet. The town had welcomed her with open arms, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. "We're finally home, Hope," she said, petting his fur. Hope sighed happily, as if he understood every word. It is best to pay homage to the past by fully welcoming the future. Life in Millbrook had found a reassuring rhythm for Claire. You were her little town, and she fell more in love with you every day. The mornings she volunteered at the shelter. The afternoons she wandered through the park with Hope. The evenings she met old friends over cups of hot tea. Hope, too, had changed. The old nervous dog waiting by the side of the road was now a happy and healthy boy. He was no longer watching the road, no longer waiting in vain. Instead, he lived every day to the fullest, at Claire's side where he always should have been. One day, visited to Claire's house with an idea. At the time, we were also talking about the fact that, Claire, you and Hope have such a phenomenal story. Have you ever thought about exposing that to more people? Claire looked up from the book she'd been reading. As in, writing about it? Sarah nodded. Yes, but also more than that. There's a program at the community center where people share their stories to inspire one another. I truly believe you and Hope could do some good there. Claire paused. She didn't know if she was prepared to confide in so many people, but when she glanced down at Hope, who was wagging his tail in excitement at Sarah's voice, she registered something. Their story was no longer only about them. It was about hope, second chances, and homecoming. Maybe it's time, Claire said gently. I believe that we could help to guide others who are lost like we were. The next week, Claire stood nervously in front of a small group of people at the community center. Gripping Hope's leash firmly, she inhaled deeply and began. 3 years ago, I drove out of this town hoping I could outrun my pain. I figured that if I just removed myself from the memories, I would be at peace. But what I didn't know was that peace wasn't about leaving. It was about confronting what I left behind. She looked around the audience as she spoke and saw nods of understanding. Men and women who'd mourned loved ones, struggled with their own demons, cried out for help in unexpected places. Hope lay next to her, his head supported on his paws, listening just as intently as the audience. Hope never abandoned me, Claire added, shaking with its quaking, and because of him, I came home. When she had finished speaking, applause erupted in the chamber. With a tear on the corner of her eye, Claire thought how far she had gotten. Over the next few weeks, Claire's story took off. She began being invited to speak at schools, shelters, and even community events. And so, her journey with Hope had become a symbol of hope for others facing their own struggles. One day, sitting on the porch with Sarah, she smiled contemplatively. I didn't think I'd ever make it here, sharing my story like this, Sarah laughed. Life has a funny way of taking us where we need to be. Hope barked his agreement, putting his head on Claire's leg. Claire understood that life would not always be easy. You would still have moments of doubt and sadness, but she had learned over time that this facing of the past was not the same as living in it. She had discovered purpose, love, and, most important, herself. Looking down at Hope, now curled up next to her on the porch, Claire whispered, "We did it, boy. We found our way back." Hope sighed, hard, as if he had always known they would. Opening our hearts is inviting others to help us heal. Claire never thought she would have such a vibrant role in the community again, that she had feared that coming to Millbrook would only serve to remind of what had happened. That had been naive. There was no such thing as hope, Ajla had learned without the people around her leading her to believe in that hope. Her and Hope were walking in the town square one morning, and she said you'd recognize people coming up to them and smiling and talking to them. "Morning, Claire," called up Mr. Henderson, the local grocer. "Hope looking great as ever." Claire smiled. "Thanks, Mr. Henderson. We're taking one day at a time." Hope bounced happily alongside her, his tail wagging as if in confirmation of Claire's words. She was thankful for the love that the town had given her, and for the first time in years she felt she was right where she belonged. One afternoon, Claire received a call from the local shelter director, a woman named Carol. "I've got an idea, Claire," Carol said excitedly. "We've watched how hope motivates people. How about if we formed a support group for people going through loss? You could help lead it." Claire was taken aback. "Me? Lead a group? I'm not sure I'm the person to do that." "Yes, you are, Claire," Carol assured her. "You've endured so much and emerged all the better for it. People have to listen to your story and see your and Hope's love." After a brief pause, Claire accepted. "Okay, let's do it. If sharing our story helps one person, it will be worth it." A week later, Claire waited nervously in the shelter's community room. There was a small group of people there, some familiar, some new. Hope next to her, feeling her fretting, supporting her by the silence. "Thank you all for coming," Claire started, her voice strong but choked. "I understand how difficult it is to heal after a loss, and I understand the power of love and community in helping facilitate that healing. As a result, survivors began to feel safe. They began to talk this time about their own experiences and struggles. A few wrote about losing cherished pets, others about personal woes. One woman, Anna, burst into tears when she spoke. "I felt totally alone losing my husband last year. But listening to your story, Claire, gives me hope that better days ahead are possible." Hope lay with his head on Anna's knee, and Claire smiled gently. "They can, Anna, and you don't have to experience it alone." The support group expanded week by week. It expanded from a venue to share sorrow, to a venue for healing, friendships, and second chances. Hope emerged as the unofficial mascot, providing comfort with each wag of her tail and gentle nuzzle. Bright-eyed and proud of how far Claire had come, Sarah attended the meetings whenever she could. "You're doing so much good, Claire. I hope you know that." Claire smiled as she watched Hope join and mingle with the group. "I think we both are." Months passed by, and Claire discovered that she could serve not only this town, but also heal people the same way she was healed. One evening, she and Hope were sitting on their porch. She gazed at the sunset with a tranquility she hadn't experienced in years. "We're right where we're supposed to be," she said with a whisper. Hope replied, sighing with pleasure, trusting and loving eyes. Sometimes, the future we never thought we wanted turns out to be the future we love most. Now, in the fall weather of Millbrook, Claire was embedded deeply into the pulse of the town. The support group meetings had turned into a guiding light for many, and each day it felt a little more like home. One cool morning, Claire and Hope strolled through the park, golden leaves crunching beneath their feet. She watched Hope run ahead, his golden coat blending in with the fall colors. So, the former lonely dog became a sign of resilience and eternal love. "You are something special, aren't you?" Claire said with a smile and a whisper. Hope barked back, his tail slashing furiously. The following day, Claire got an email from a regional pet therapy group. They had heard of Hope's story and wanted to invite Claire to share their journey at an upcoming conference. The idea of addressing a big crowd made Claire nervous, but encouragement from Sarah helped Claire make the decision. "You and Hope have already inspired so many here, Claire," Sarah told me over coffee. "This is your opportunity to extend further." Claire breathed deep, feeling her heart lift as she looked down at Hope, who looked back up at her with his familiar expression of trust. "Okay, let's do it." The weeks that followed were devoted to planning. Claire rewrote her speech for hours, recounting the pivotal points of their journey: the heartbreak of leaving, the isolation, then the healing. Her logical brain was matching pieces of her heart together with each word. Hope sat beside her through it all, a constant source of comfort. One evening, during her rehearsals with Sarah and Carol, Claire's voice faltered. "What if I can't do this? What if I lose it in front of everyone?" Carol smiled warmly. "Claire, people want to hear real stories. And you, darling, have one of the most beautiful ones to tell." Claire understood. An ache of her own journey nestled in her chest. "I think it's time to release it." The morning of the conference was upon Claire, who was backstage, her heart racing. The room was packed with hundreds of people, most of whom were waiting to hear her story. Taking a deep breath, she walked onto the stage, Hope trotting beside her. The audience expressed softening to see the faithful golden retriever with her side by side. 3 years ago, I made the most difficult decision of my life, Claire started. I left a town, a life, the best friend I ever had. But what I hadn't realized was that love, real love, never gives up. Hope waited for me, and in the end, he returned me home. And so Claire's words came out pretty naturally, laced with some emotion and gratitude throughout the speech. Hope patiently sat at her feet, as if he understood the gravity of this moment. At the conclusion of the presentation, the room broke into applause. Claire types this with a tear, knowing she did not just speak her words, she spoke them into hearts. Back in Millbrook, Claire was energized with a new sense of purpose. She continued working at the shelter, began writing her memoir, and looked for new ways to help people and their pets heal. One afternoon, sitting on the porch with Hope napping in the sun, she was joined by Sarah. "So, what's next?" Sarah asked with a grin. Claire laughed softly. "I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, I'm ready." Hope opened an eye, as if to assent. The best way to honor the past is by building a future that is full of love. Following the conference, Claire was overwhelmed with messages from people around the country whose lives had been touched by her story. Every single message was a reminder of what connection can do and the footprint hope left on the hearts of so many. Claire sat at her desk and wept as she read through the emails. "Claire, your experience with Hope inspired me to get a rescue dog. Thankful you told your story." She smiled down at Hope, curled up next to her chair. "We're helping, boy," she said quietly, caressing his golden coat. Then, urged on by Sarah and Carol, Claire took it a step further. She began to develop a program called Hope's Second Chance that would pair rescue dogs with people in need of companionship and healing. "Just think," Claire told Sarah one afternoon, "about matching dogs like Hope with people who need a second chance at life, like us." Sarah grinned. "I think it's a wonderful idea, Claire, and I know exactly who I want to help get it going." Collectively, they approached the town's mayor, who was more than supportive of the initiative. "Millbrook has always been that place of second chances," he said with warmth. "Let's make this happen." Creating a program from the ground up was not without its challenges. The task proved daunting. Claire was contending not just with logistical and funding issues, but also the sheer scale of finding proper matches for the dogs. But Hope was there, steadfast, and she found the strength to keep going. There were days when doubts crept in, times when Claire questioned if she was biting off more than she could chew. But then she'd look to Hope, the love and patience and loyalty that had kept him waiting for her this long shining in his eyes. "I can do this," she would murmur to him one night, "if you can wait 3 years for me." The program was built, and after months of arduous work, it accepted its first participant, James, an elderly veteran who had recently lost his wife and was struggling with loneliness. Then something magical happened when Claire introduced him to a gentle Labrador named Daisy. James went down on his knees, and Daisy immediately leaned her head against his chest, as though she knew he needed comfort. Tears welled in James' eyes. "She's perfect. Thank you, Claire." Claire saw the action unfold, knowing she was in her place. News of Hope's second chance spread fast, and before long, inquiries from nearby towns reached Claire. Local businesses came together to donate sponsorships, and volunteers poured in to assist with the cause. At the shelter, Carol glowed with pride. "You've accomplished something quite extraordinary here, Claire. Hope must be so proud." Claire crouched next to Hope, scratching his ears. "I couldn't have done it without him." Claire felt that she was a full circle in part of the thriving program that you see today. What was once a story of loss and longing was now a story of hope and healing. As Claire sat on the porch with Sarah one evening, she said, "I thought I was running away from my past. But now I realize I was running toward something bigger." Sarah smiled, and hope had driven the whole thing. Claire breathed in and gazed upon the horizon filled with gratitude. Literally, a journey begins with the first step, and it's always the people who join you that matters. Claire's little project, called Hope's Second Chance, was no longer just local. It had spread beyond Millbrook's borders, inviting people from surrounding towns and cities. Shelters throughout the region started contacting one another, interested in joining the movement. What began as a needles-free journey had turned into an needles journey beyond anything Claire could have ever dreamed of. One morning, sitting in the shelter reviewing applications, Claire received an unexpected phone call. "Hi, Claire. This is Angela from the State Animal Welfare Organization. We've heard a lot of your program, and we'd like to talk about how we might partner." Claire's eyes widened with surprise. "Wow, I want to talk more about it." Angela had a warm and supportive voice. "Your work inspires so many human beings. Let's meet next week and see how we can support your vision." Claire hung up the phone and glanced down at Hope, who was looking at her attentively. "Hey, buddy, looks like our little project is about to get bigger." Hope wagged his tail with excitement as if he knew what the moment meant. As it grew, new challenges presented themselves. Claire was sharing her time between meetings, paperwork, and public appearances. Managing that with caring for Hope and her own well-being was harder than she expected. Sarah, seeing the fatigue creeping into Claire's eyes, stepped in. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. Let me help." Reluctantly, Claire agreed. They gathered a small but passionate team of volunteers who believed in their vision. It was not easy for Claire to delegate tasks, but she recognized it was a prerequisite for ensuring the long-term success of the program. Now that the new team was in place, they started creating more structured adoption practices, hosting fundraising events and forming collaboration with local businesses. And then, one day, during one of their outreach events at a neighboring town's shelter, Claire spotted an elderly woman standing silently near the fence, observing the dogs interact with potential adopters. Walking gently toward her, Claire said, "Do you want to meet one of them?" The woman paused, then nodded. Claire introduced her to a gentle spaniel named Lucy, whose tale of abandonment paralleled the woman's own loss. Tears started welling up in woman's eyes as Lucy pressed up against her. I think she needs me as much as I need her." Moments like these helped reaffirm to Claire that she was doing the right thing. Every connection, every adoption, was yet another small miracle in a world that could use a whole lot more kindness. Just when everything was falling into place, Claire got invited to a statewide animal welfare conference. She had been recognized for an award acknowledging outstanding contributions to animal rescue efforts. "You've come a long way, Claire," Sarah said proudly. "You and Hope deserve this." She stared at the invitation in disbelief and pride. "It's not just us, Sarah. It's all of those people who put their faith in this." Somewhat, she was shaking with emotion as she held the trophy in front of the standing room only audience at the conference. "This is for every dog who's ever waited for a second chance, and every person willing to give them one." Hope lay beside her, his tail thumping the stage, a reminder of how it all started. But then Claire took stock of all they had accomplished, and she knew they had so much left to do. But for the first time in a long time, she finally felt at peace, knowing that Hope's story had resonated with so many. Sitting on the steps of the shelter, sunsetting the harbor, she murmured, "We did good, Hope. And we are just getting started." Hope snuggled closer, and while their journey was only beginning, the road ahead was full of endless possibilities. But a true friend is never separated. Page 319. As Hope's second chance picked up speed, Claire was busier than ever. Between running the shelter, making speaking appearances, and facilitating adoptions, her days were long but rewarding. Through all of her crushing obligations, she never lost faith in the good and quiet moments with Hope. The simple strolls around town, the joy in his tail's thump as she walked through the door, the warmth he injected into her life. One morning, Sarah jogged up to Claire and Hope as they strolled through the park, panting but smiling. "Hey, superstar," she teased. "I heard you're going to be in the local paper." Claire chuckled, shaking her head. "It's not about me, Sarah. It's about Hope and what he has inspired in all of us." Sarah nodded. "Still, you should be proud. You've created something beautiful." Just as the stars were about to align, Claire got some bad news. The town council was reevaluating the lease agreement for the shelter's property, and there was a possibility they would not be able to renew it. "What do you mean, we could lose the shelter?" "Are you sure?" Claire asked, trembling at the voice coming to her by phone from Carol. "Budget cuts," Carol said with grave assurance. "They're contemplating repurposing the land for something else. We'll have to make our case and demonstrate to them how critical the shelter is to the community." Claire got a rush of panic, but quickly pulled herself together. "Over my dead body. We're not going down without a fight. I propose we have a town meeting. We're going to show them how much this shelter means to people." Claire, Sarah, and the shelter volunteers swung into action. They printed flyers, got the word out on social media, and contacted local news stations. The day of the meeting, the town hall was filled with supporters, families who had adopted pets, volunteers who had given time, even the mayor himself. Claire stood in the front of the room, jitters coursing through her stomach. "This shelter isn't just an animal shelter," she began. "It's a second chance for the animals and for the humans who love them. Hope's story proves that." Her slideshow played behind her a mix of happy families with the lives the shelter had changed. Photos of happy families with their adopted pets filled the screen, and Claire could spot tears in the eyes of many of those in the audience. The mayor finally broke the silence. "Claire, you've made this shelter a vital part of our town. We'll figure out how to make it work." Jubilant cheers erupted all around the room, and Claire released a long sigh of relief and embraced Sarah and Carol in tight hugs. "We did it," she whispered. The shelter was full of laughter and joy that evening. Volunteers south up to congratulate them, and Claire couldn't help but smile as she watched Hope weave in and out of people, soaking up the love and attention. Sarah raised a glass to Claire and Hope, proof that second chances change lives. Claire flushed, lifting her own glass. "To all of us. All of this is not possible without this incredible community." As the festivities drew to a close, Claire sat on the porch of her house staring up at the twinkling stars overhead. Hope lay next to her, his head on her lap. "We've really made it, haven't we?" she said softly, running her hand against his fur. Hope sighed softly, his eyes shining with the same fierce love and loyalty that had led them here. No matter what came next, they would face it together, Claire thought, smiling. The hardest journeys sometimes lead us right where we need to go. It had been months since the town disagreed to save the shelter, and life in Millbrook had returned to a peaceful, familiar rhythm. Claire felt at home, not just in the town, but in herself. The same heart that had once driven her away was now beating with a renewed sense of belonging and purpose. On a still autumn morning, Claire settled on the porch with Hope at her feet, sipping a cup of hot coffee while gold leaves circled them. She looked on as Hope's eyes traveled across the horizon, not seeking, but content. "You waited, didn't you, for so long," she said, rubbing behind his ears. "And now we're exactly where we need to be." Hope sighed softly, laying his head on her lap, his tail thumping lightly. When Claire moved to town, her life was busy, but a lot of it was long, unspent days, because she was widowed in late summer. She had been invited to speak about the shelter's journey and how Hope's story had motivated so many. Claire stood on the small stage looking out over the crowd and took a deep breath. 3 years ago, I made the toughest decision of my life. I lost a town and a home and my best friend ever. I thought I was running away from pain, but what I was actually running away from was healing. She glanced down at Hope, sitting vigilantly beside her. But love never turned its back on me. Hope never gave up on me. And thank you all, you brought us back. There was a round of applause, and Claire smiled through tears, knowing this was where she was supposed to be. The rescue center had expanded far beyond what Claire could have dreamed. Dozens of rescue dogs had found forever homes thanks to the success of the Hope's Second Chance program, and support from the community continued to grow. It's one afternoon, Sarah sitting with Claire at the shelter, as a young couple adopt a shy terrier named Max. "You did this, Claire," Sarah said quietly. "You gave first people and dogs a second chance." Claire smiled in disbelief. "We did this, all of us. Hope, the town, and all those who believed in a better tomorrow." And Hope, as though somehow sensing this moment, barked happily and skipped up to him, his attachment wiggling happily. Claire and Hope strolled through the park there one last time that night before returning home. The trail they had walked through 1,000 times felt new. It felt more detached now, more filled with peace than yearning. "You saved me, buddy," Claire whispered, kneeling next to him. "You taught me what it means to never give up." Hope sank into her, his eyes speaking the love that had passed between them through every ordeal and victory. Claire got up, inhaling deeply. "Come on, let's go home." The sky was dressed in sunset on the porch swing at the house Claire felt. Hope curled next to her, breathing tranquil and slow. For the first time in years, Claire felt whole. She had returned, not just to Millbrook, but to herself. And when the evening sky was smeared with twinkling stars, she said, "Thank you for waiting for me." Hope let out a quiet, satisfied sigh, his tail thumping against the wooden floor, brilliant white as if to say, "I always knew you'd come back." Their journey had been one of loss, of love, of second chances. Claire and Hope's story would live on, not only in their hearts, but in the lives they had affected along the way. Sometimes love is not about where you've been, but where you're supposed to go.